We are pleased to have Annika Stensson from the National Restaurant Association to present to us today. Annika is Director of Research Communications at the National Restaurant Association. She is responsible for raising the profile of the organization's multifaceted research and directing cohesive research communications in support of programs and initiatives across the organization. Her responsibilities include turning statistics, analysis, and trends data into strategic communications for reports, digital and social media, and resources for association members and the news media. She also serves as an expert spokesperson on restaurant operator and consumer trends. Annika has collaborated with the research department for more than a decade on consumer polls and operator survey content. She is the primary developer of the organization's high-profile What's Hot Chef survey and a key contributor to the annual flagship Restaurant Industry Forecast. Previously, Annika has had various positions in the communications department since joining the National Restaurant Association in 1999. A native of Sweden, she holds a journalism degree from the University of Maryland. Please join me in welcoming Annika Stensson.
Thank you so much. Plan to get in a little bit of detail on each of these areas here today. First, again, for context, let's start with just a very wide 10,000-foot view of the restaurant industry as it looks today. First, the definition. When I talk about the restaurant industry, I talk about all meals and snacks prepared away from home, including all takeout meals and beverages. So that's a little bit wider than a lot of people think of when they hear the term restaurant. It is, of course, table service and limited service restaurants, but it's wider than that. Anything from food trucks, caterers, coffee shops, managed services at places like hospitals, university dining halls, for example, concessions at sporting and entertainment venues, airports, non-commercial food service at places like schools and nursing homes, and also military food service. So with that in mind, these are our projections for this year. We expect sales to reach $799 billion in more than 1 million locations, supporting 14.7 million employees. And our industry really is an economic powerhouse. If our industry were a country, we'd have a larger economic output than most countries around the world, including countries like Thailand and Argentina, and my native Sweden, actually. And sales growth alone in our industry is projected to be larger than total sales for a lot of other industries. Like this example here, it is much more than Hollywood makes in a year. And when it comes to consumer spending, 13% of typical household expenditure in America goes toward food, and this is food at home as well as away from home. Housing and transportation are the biggest categories, but food is number 3. And to break that 13% down a little bit further, and looking back in time, back in 1955, this is when dining out was mainly reserved maybe for special occasions or business travel, tourism, things like that. Back then, consumers spent about 25% or a quarter of their food budget in restaurants. So fast forward to today, obviously society looks very different today than it did 60-some years ago, as far as household structures, as far as lifestyles, as far as need for convenience. And today, consumers spend almost half of their food budget in restaurants. Shifting gears a little bit to overall away from consumers and into the operator space, we poll restaurant operators on a monthly basis on what their top challenge is at any given point in time. And as you can see here, a snapshot over the last 3 years for the month of January. We're seeing recruiting employees used to not be too big a deal back in 2014, but today it is the top challenge for nearly a third of operators. And labor cost follows suit there. That is obviously a big deal as well. About a third of sales in a restaurant go toward labor cost under normal circumstances, so any pressures there are going to be felt throughout the operations. And part of the reason for that is because the nation's economy is making gradual improvements. Employment is picking up, making the labor pool shallower, and therefore competition for employees much more fierce, not just within the restaurant industry, but also with other industries. And that is especially concerning for our industry because it's very labor intensive. So you can see sales per employee in grocery stores is about 4 times as much as in a restaurant, and even more in places like car dealerships, for example, or gas stations. And at the same time, productivity in restaurants have been flat over the last decade. The overall economy, or at least non-farm economy, has managed to increase productivity a little bit, but again, we've been flat primarily because of this labor-intensive nature of the restaurant operations. But here, of course, is where technology can make some difference, both on the consumer side as well as the back of the house side. So with that as a backdrop, take a closer look at the consumer trends in this space. First, consumers generally recognize the benefits of technology, and some of them are even starting to make that part of their decision matrix when they choose a restaurant. Currently, 26%, or about a quarter, of consumers say they actually factor that in when they make a restaurant choice. And some go even further than that. 20%, so 1 out of 5 consumers, say they actually prefer to deal with just technology when they dine out or order food from a restaurant, don't want to deal with humans at all. That is obviously not a majority of consumers out there, but it is a growing number of people who prefer to use the machines. But overall, for not using technology in restaurants, the primary reason for that is still that consumers want to just simply deal with humans. They find it easier to do that. So that would be the blue here, or looks purple on that. But about half of consumers say that's their primary reason for not using technology. But we see 22% also say they're not using it because it's not there. So some of the technology that consumers are using in store are these, and at least something that they've been using in the last year. And this survey is from December, so basically in 2016. Wi-Fi is the most common usage. More than half have connected to that at some point. Tableside payment, also pretty common, and then a little less so, but still about a third for ordering in table service, tableside stations, or for touchscreen kiosks in limited service. But 29% haven't used any of those at all. So because these technologies are not available in every restaurant, we also ask consumers the hypothetical of if they were available, would you use them? And as you can see, the numbers jump pretty significantly here, except for the 18%. So again, almost 1 out of 5 say they're not willing to use any of these, even if they had them in front of them. And when it comes to smartphones, seems like everyone has one these days, and that's almost true, at least when it comes to younger consumers. Millennials specifically, virtually everyone has one there. Overall, 3/4 should be, actually have a smartphone or tablet that they use regularly these days. Even half of senior citizens do, so it is pretty common. And we ask consumers what they use their phones for when it comes to restaurant-related activities or tasks. The most commonly used basic information about a restaurant, looking up directions, hours and directions. Also looking at menus, that's pretty important. People like to do that. But I want to point out here, 63% have actually used their smartphones to order delivery or takeout at some point. It's a pretty significant percentage. So good to know and keep in mind that having that option on phones is something that consumers actually use a lot. And about a third also use their phones occasionally to pay for meals. So again, back to the hypothetical, since mobile payment isn't available everywhere, again, we ask consumers, if it were available, would you use it? And here we see kind of a curious trend when it comes to technology. About a third said that they use their phones to pay for meals on occasion, but when we ask the hypothetical, it's about the same percentage. Normally, the willingness is higher than the actuality, but not here. And another curious trend that we're going to keep an eye on is that it's actually trending down. Willingness to use is actually trending down. And that is, again, uncommon in the technology space. Usually it goes up. The more consumers are familiar with it and understand the process and have used it and see the benefits. So again, not sure why that is, but again, keeping an eye on it. The percentages are not dropping off significantly. These are kind of small blips, but still, again, keeping an eye on. And continuing in the hypothetical, technically these various technologies do exist today, but they're very rare, so most consumers have not encountered them. But we ask them if they like the idea of these things in restaurants. And it turns out that most people, or a majority at least, think that wearable technologies for servers, and that would be something like an Apple Watch, for example, to buzz them when you need something at your table, is something that they like the idea of. They also like handheld scanners for things like allergens or bacteria. You can obviously see the benefits of that on the consumer side if you have an allergy, for example, to know if there's something in your food. Ordering, predictive ordering, essentially, getting ordering suggestions based on what you ordered previously or what you've already selected, kind of how Netflix suggests what to watch next based on what you've already watched. And we're seeing audio ordering, also fairly decent percentage of consumers who are liking the idea of that, and that will be something like iPhone Siri or Amazon's Alexa to verbally order takeout or delivery with. And lastly, on the decent, okay, like scale would be adjustable menu prices based on demand. So kind of like the Uber model, it's going to cost more when demand is higher and there are fewer drivers out there. Uber doesn't do this, but maybe restaurants could give a discount or lower price during off-peak hours, for example. A little less interest, more acceptance of robotics and automation here, and that is likely because it's still very rare and a lot of consumers don't really get the idea of what that would look like. Kind of, you get, I'm probably dating myself now, but again, like a cartoon Jetson-y type mental image when you hear serving robots or something like that. Obviously, that's not actually what it looks like, but it could be that. And I should say here that the percentage up to 100 is not necessarily the ones who say they dislike it. There's also a fair percentage of people who are unsure at this point. They just don't know how they feel about it. But in general, consumers are on board with technology. They say it increases convenience, speeds up service and order accuracy, but 37%, so that's almost 2 out of 5 consumers still say that it complicates the restaurant experience. That is obviously the opposite of what you want to happen when you install any kind of technology, customer-facing technology, in your operations. So that is sort of concerning, a bit of a challenge to sort of solve that puzzle as to why that is. And we actually ask consumers why that is, why they find or what they find complicated about it. And obviously there's some subjectivity here as far as how many steps are too many steps, how long is too long, and also what does user-friendly mean to you. Some of that is going to be based on experience, what they've used before, and if they know it or don't know it after that. But the fact that you can't ask questions and that there are no instructions is a concern for a majority of consumers. So this is where the human factor, human element of service is still important. Even if you have ordering kiosks or anything in-store to that effect, it's important to have staff there to be able to guide the consumer through the process if they're not familiar with it. And just kind of food for thought as far as some fun factor here of is it going to be worth the investment to add some customer-facing technology to an operation. About a third of consumers say it makes dining out more fun, makes them order or dine out more often, pretty important. And as we said previously, 26% say it makes them choose one restaurant over another. But just like the mobile payment, we're seeing a curious trend here about their enthusiasm for the use of these technologies. They are using them more. Acceptance is greater than it has been in previous years, but their enthusiasm is actually trending down. So much like the mobile payment statistics, they're not significant drops by any means here, but it is curious that they are trending down. Maybe it is a little bit of tech fatigue is setting in, or maybe that 37% of consumers who say that it makes things more complicated are also factored into these, if that number, we've actually surveyed for that over several years, and it's been very similar over time. So not a lot of changes have been made in that area. So now moving on to the operator side, current usage, attitudes towards technology in restaurants, and also some hypotheticals there as well. Currently, actually we did a survey in April of last year, so almost exactly a year ago, sponsored by American Express, exploring primarily customer-facing technology and the adoption thereof among restaurant operators. So this is from that survey. We're seeing some technologies have a higher adoption rate than others, POS systems, websites, but still not everyone has those. Still kind of curious, right? After that, adoption drops off a little bit, and it also varies by segment. You see highlighted in yellow here are the technologies where limited service restaurants are significantly more likely to have them in place than table service restaurants at this time. And that makes sense because online ordering, smartphone apps, and mobile payment are all things that facilitate off-site transactions or off-premise transactions, which are hallmarks of limited service. We're also seeing some adoption differences between independent operations as well as chain and franchisee operations, again highlighted in yellow. Technologies where franchisees and chain restaurants are much more likely to have these in place. And the reason for that is because they typically can tap into a network of resources from the overall brand that the independent operator does not have access to. And just taking a look at some of the features of some of these technologies, the most common features, and this is pretty much true within segments as well as ownership types. Basic business tools are the most common features, and a little less common, cloud-based storage, and customer demographic data collection, big data for marketing purposes. And online reservations, obviously in the table service space, primarily using a service for that, and a service would be something like OpenTable, but some also have a proprietary system, is what I'm trying to say. And as far as online ordering, it is more common to have a proprietary system, but a fair number are also using a service, and a service would be something like Grubhub, or Seamless, or Uber Eats, or Postmates, or what have you. And when it comes to mobile payment, on the table service side, again, very small percentage here, only 15% of table service restaurants currently accept it. But among those, more than half use NFC or Bluetooth, and that will be your Apple Pay, Samsung Pay, anything that you swipe your device in front of a beacon to close out that transaction. The in-app or frictionless types of mobile payment are all in-app, so something like OpenTable payment, for example, sort of the Uber model where transactions start and end within the app without using any external receiver. And smartphone app features, again, similar across segments and ownership categories, kind of mirror what consumers tend to look up when they use their smartphones, so that makes sense. Looking at menus, maps and directions, loyalty programs, also pretty common. And when it comes to restaurant operators' reasoning for adding a smartphone app to their repertoire, or developing it, or adopting it, whichever the case may be, more than half say it's because they want to build sales and traffic. Makes sense. But a third say that it's for customer engagement reasons. And here we do see some differences between segments and ownership categories. In this case, limited service restaurants and chains and franchisees tend to be more likely to say their primary reason is to build sales and traffic. And table service restaurants and independent operations are a little bit more likely to say their primary reason is for customer engagement. But overall, when it comes to customer-facing technology, there's sort of wide categories. What restaurants see as the top benefit to that, split pretty evenly between meeting consumer demand for these things, as well as improved speed of service. So again, the speed of service would be labor-related, so that can be beneficial on that end. Actually controlling labor costs, relatively low. On this end, probably because it's customer-facing, the more labor-saving things are probably in the back of the house. They certainly will help servers and front-of-the-house staff, but mostly to facilitate things rather than replace things. And again, primarily we focused in that survey on front-of-the-house things or customer-facing technology, but we did throw in digital recruiting as well as digital scheduling. And here you can see there are not huge differences other than for limited service restaurants and, for franchisees and chain restaurants are more likely to do both. And overall, we found that 42% of restaurant operators said that they plan to devote more resources, and that will be budgetary resources as well as other resources like human time and effort to technology in 2016 over 2015. And it seems pretty even between hardware and software. But despite that, a majority of restaurant operators still consider their restaurant operations mainstream when it comes to technology adoption. About a third, that's a pretty high percentage, about a third consider their operation lagging. And only 12% say that they're actually cutting edge in this area. And here, again, some differences between segments and ownership categories. Primarily, the difference here is that franchisees and chains are more likely to say that they're cutting edge, and independent operations and table service restaurants, the categories are more likely to say that they're actually lagging. Looking forward a little bit, the most important area of development, again, very wide buckets here, but not customer ordering is where people really want to put their effort. Restaurant operators want to put their effort. That makes sense. If you recall, 63% of consumers say they use their phones to order delivery or takeout occasionally, and that would mean there are even more out there who use their laptop computers, or tower computers for that matter, to do the same. So that makes perfect sense. For loyalty programs and payment options are also up there. A little less interest in robotics and automation, again, but again, there's a lot of unfamiliar territory when it comes to that in restaurant operations, trying to figure out where it can actually make a difference and where it's going to be a hindrance if it's just an expensive piece of furniture sitting in the back of the house that's not doing what you want it to do. And just like we did with consumers, we asked restaurant operators also, sort of hypothetical, if while these technologies do exist, they are not readily available to a lot of operators out there, especially for those who don't even have a POS system in place right now. But we asked them if you had access to this right now, would you implement it? Predictive ordering, again, the Netflix model of suggesting additional items based on what consumers have already picked is of interest to more than half of operators. And more than a third say that automatic price adjustment, again, the Uber model then, is of interest to their restaurant as well. Less interest, again, in robotics and automation, but there is some curiosity there still. And just like consumers, we asked restaurant operators about their likes and dislikes as far as the idea of these technologies. Pretty split even as far as food prep automation and robotics and cooking robots. That was something consumers were not too hot on, but that's back of the house, so consumers wouldn't necessarily know they're there. Serving robots, not particularly popular, probably again because got a little bit of a difficulty imagining what that might look like in a typical restaurant, and understandably so. Also, significant cost to invest in technology that is so new that it's not really on the common market yet. Food safety tech is of interest, just like it is to consumers, and that is for obvious reasons. So what stops restaurant operators from implementing more technology? Obviously, the interest is there, consumer interest is there, their benefits are there, but we have actually surveyed for this at several points in time and gotten very similar results over time. Cost of implementation is the primary barrier still for a lot of operators out there. Other cost-related barriers include service and repair of items that will go, especially for automation and robotics, have a lot of moving parts. Transaction and usage cost, also a concern. Lack of infrastructure could also be tied to cost, of course. If you don't have a solid base to build on, you're going to have to start with the basics as far as investing in technology. Customer acceptance, for good reason. We've seen there is some hesitation out there among consumers for at least some technologies. Staff training, again, also something to keep in mind. Your technology is not going to work unless your staff embraces it, knows how to use it, and can guide consumers through the process. But again, much like consumers, restaurant operators are generally on board with the benefits of technology. It can increase sales, speed up service, make your restaurant more productive, provide a competitive edge. But there is a difference here when it comes to restaurant operators who believe that consumers factor this in when they choose a restaurant. If you recall from the beginning of the presentation, that was 26% of consumers said they actually did that. Here we have 72% of restaurant operators believing they do. So more in line with the operators who strongly agree with that statement. And unfortunately, they are more in agreement when it comes to technology making the restaurant experience more complicated. 37% on the consumer side, 47% on the restaurant operator side. Again, just sort of highlighting the importance of looking at the user experience in addition to how it integrates with back-of-the-house processes when it comes to adding new technology, and also what works best for your operation. Not all technologies are the same, obviously. Not all platforms are the same. So it's critically important to do your research beforehand before choosing which one works best for you. So just to summing things up, interest in technology is definitely growing on the consumer side, but there is still some hesitation among some of the more cutting-edge types of technologies out there, especially robotics and automation. Adoption among restaurant operators is growing for all kinds of technologies, except for robotics and automation. There's hesitation there still. But cost is still a huge barrier to sort of being more tech-forward among some restaurant operators. And in general, both operators and consumers are on board with the benefits, but there's still some things that complicate the process. So the challenge going forward is to figure out exactly what those are and find solutions that work for both sides. And that is what I have for you today. So happy to take any questions if you have them. Yes?
Any solid resources that you recommend? I mean, I'm specifically looking for good online with a mobile app interface for scheduling, and then also building in labor costs with that, and potentially integrating with the time clocks.
Okay. Are you asking about types of?
Yeah. Okay. Like, you know, there's 7 shifts when I work. I mean, it's kind of there's a ton to sort through. Don't get any recommendations.
Right. You know, we do not. I know that our marketing and sponsorship folks have been working with hot schedules, and I think they have some solutions along those lines. I can't recite to you exactly what those are because I'm not that familiar with the company, but I know it's someone that we work with, and probably a good time to explore those types of things up on the show floor. I'm sure there are plenty of those companies up there. And also, I would say a good source just to do your research is probably to check some of the trade publications, like Nation's Restaurant News, Hospitality Technology, for example, to see if they have reviews of several different products or just more information about several different products. Yes, sir.
You didn't get to this on your presentation, but reservation systems or you know, waiting with using text messaging, those kind of systems, I'm kind of looking into that this summer. Does that work? Is it cool?
Yes, it can certainly be beneficial if you have a restaurant that is very busy at certain times. And in most restaurants, so I assume in yours too, waiting space is limited. So the benefit is obviously that if someone comes in, it looks really full, and they say they have to wait an hour for a table, if they have to stand there in a crowded space, they're probably not going to stick around, right? So if you can text them, if they're at a bar next door, and they will come back, then you get a seat from that. So it is effective. We know this anecdotally. We haven't researched this. Again, that we back at the house technology, we haven't quite gotten our funding to do a survey on that yet, but we're looking at it. And I would say also it was fairly common feature of POS systems to have table management as part of that. So obviously that's a good base to build on depending on what POS system you have. Yes?
Parlaying onto that, do you have any recommendations for that? If you're looking at that also, front of the house, where they map the floor, as well as capture some of the trends from the customers, the returning customers who have this stuff?
Right. I don't have any brand recommendations. I'm not aware of. That's kind of a different part of our organization as far as working with specific brand names. But again, it is something that is of growing interest, obviously on the table service side more than limited service. But I will say that the use of big data in marketing is kind of a vast space that has been underexplored so far. And big data in a single restaurant might sound like a weird terminology, but you know what I'm talking about. So it certainly can be mined for a lot of information. The more you collect, the more you can use it going forward. And there are certainly programs that integrate both. All right, well then, thank you very much. And stay safe and warm in the snow and enjoy the rest of the show.